In the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, a kingdom that had stood for over 1,000 years was about to be wiped from the map in the most catastrophic siege of the medieval world. This is the Battle of Châu Thịnh in 1471, the most brutal ancient battle that decided the fate of entire civilizations. An invading army of 250,000 soldiers bore down on a dying kingdom with nowhere left to run. Kingdoms would fall, empires would be rewritten, and the map of Southeast Asia would never be the same. If you love pulse-pounding military history that gives you chills, smash that like button right now and hit subscribe. Every like and every subscription really helps us develop the channel and keeps us making new gripping historical battles for you. To understand the apocalypse that was coming, you have to go back to what the Champa Kingdom was, and how it had held on to power against impossible odds for over 1,000 years. Since before the 4th century, the Kingdom of Champa had ruled the coastlines and river valleys of what we now call Vietnam. They were a maritime power. They were traders. They were warriors who had fought off invasions, pirates, and rival kingdoms across nearly 2,000 years of constant warfare. The Champa people had built cities, temples, and monuments that rivaled the greatest civilizations of their time. They had culture, they had prestige, they had history written in stone and blood. But by the middle of the 15th century, everything was crumbling. To the north, the Đại Việt Kingdom, soon to become modern Vietnam, was expanding relentlessly southward in what historians call the Nam Vang, the march to the south. For centuries, they had been slowly, methodically, inexorably pushing down the coastline, conquering Champa territory piece by piece. The Champa people were being squeezed. Their heartland was shrinking. Their population was dwindling. Their culture was being absorbed, erased, ground down under the weight of Đại Việt conquest and colonization. By 1471, the Champa Kingdom was on its last breath. The reigning king was a man named Cham Thân, and he was desperate. His kingdom was reduced to the central highlands and the southern coast. His armies were weakened from decades of constant fighting. His people were starving. His treasury was empty. He watched as the Đại Việt army massed on his borders, growing larger by the month, preparing for what everyone knew would be the final blow, the last invasion that would erase Champa from existence forever. The Đại Việt commander orchestrating this catastrophe was one of history, its most brilliant and ruthless military strategists, Emperor Lê Thánh Tôn. This man was a genius of warfare. He was a visionary who understood that to destroy Champa completely, he could not simply win battles. He had to annihilate them. He had to make their destruction so total, so complete, so overwhelming that the Champa people would never rise again. He assembled the largest army ever brought together in Southeast Asia up to that point, 250,000 soldiers, cavalry units, infantry regiments, siege engineers, archers by the thousands, supply lines stretching for hundreds of miles. This was not a raid. This was not a skirmish. This was industrial-scale military annihilation. Emperor Lê Thánh Tôn had one objective: destroy the Champa Kingdom utterly and completely. And he had mobilized the entire resources of the Đại Việt state to accomplish it. King Cham Thân knew what was coming. He had nowhere to hide. His last fortress, his last stronghold, his final line of defense was the city of Châu Thịnh, located in what we now call Binh Dinh province in central Vietnam. It was not an impregnable fortress. It was not a military marvel. It was just a walled city, the last place Champa could make a stand. And Cham Thân knew that when this wall fell, his kingdom would fall with it. The terrible irony was that Cham Thân and his generals knew they could not win. They knew the odds were impossible. They knew that 250,000 soldiers was an army so vast, so overwhelming, so crushing in its superiority that no defense could possibly hold against it. But they also knew that surrender meant slavery, torture, and the complete erasure of everything they had built. So they chose to fight. They chose to stand on the walls of Châu Thịnh and face down the greatest military machine Southeast Asia had ever assembled. They chose defiance in the face of certain annihilation. When the Đại Việt army arrived at Châu Thịnh, the very earth seemed to shake beneath their footsteps. The sound was indescribable, the clanging of 250,000 soldiers, the percussion of war drums echoing across the valleys, the thunder of cavalry units galloping across the plains. Dust clouds rose so high they blotted out the sun itself. The smell was suffocating. Sweat, horses, leather, metal. The sickening stench of thousands of humans crammed into an enormous army moving as a single organism of war. Cham then stood on the walls of Châu Thịnh and watched them come. The gates were sealed. The walls were manned by what remained of his soldiers, desperate men who knew this was the last moment, the final hour, the point of no return. The Champa defenders had maybe 5,000 soldiers left, against 250,000. The math was not complicated. The outcome was not in doubt. But in that moment, standing on those walls, they were no longer afraid. They had moved past fear into something else entirely, a kind of grim, terrible acceptance mixed with pure, undiluted rage. These were men who had inherited a 1,000-year-old kingdom. These were warriors whose ancestors had fought pirates, monsters, and invaders since before the medieval world even had a name. They were going to die, but they were not going to die quiet. They were not going to die begging. They were going to die fighting. The siege began with a ferocity that split the sky. David siege engineers brought battering rams the size of buildings, constructed from entire tree trunks bound with iron. They rolled them forward across the plains toward the gates of Châu Thịnh, while Champa archers on the walls raked them with arrows that bounced harmlessly off the protective wooden shields covering the rams. The percussion of those rams striking the gates was rhythmic and relentless. Boom, 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 like the heartbeat of death itself, growing closer and closer with each impact. The walls of Châu Thịnh were not particularly tall or well engineered. They had been built centuries ago when military architecture was a different science entirely. David siege engineers immediately set up massive trebuchets and catapults, machines capable of launching boulders the size of human heads over the walls and into the city itself. The stones fell like rain. They crushed buildings. They exploded in the streets. They killed civilians sheltering in their homes. The destruction was indiscriminate and absolute. Champa soldiers poured boiling water and hot oil down onto the David soldiers trying to scale the walls with siege ladders. Men screamed as their skin bubbled and their flesh melted from the heat. Bodies fell from the ladders like broken dolls. But for every David soldier that fell, 3 more immediately took his place, climbing over the corpses of their brothers to reach the top. The David had the numbers. They had the resources. They had the sheer brutal humanity to soak up casualties like nothing else on earth. Inside the city, King Cham Thân and his generals watched the disaster unfold. Arrows were running low. Food supplies were dwindling at an impossible rate. The population was exploding as refugees poured in from the surrounding countryside, seeking shelter that the city could not possibly provide. Sanitation was breaking down. Disease was beginning to spread. The water supply was contaminated. Wounded men lay in the streets, crying out for help that nobody could provide. The David bombardment continued for days, weeks, months. The walls, which had stood for centuries, began to crumble under the relentless pounding of siege weapons. Huge sections collapsed. The city, its defenders had to scramble to construct makeshift fortifications inside the city, creating secondary defensive lines. But everyone knew the truth. The only question was not whether the city would fall, but how long it would take and how many people would die in the process. At one point, King Cham then attempted a desperate sortie, a massive breakout attack where his remaining cavalry charged out through the gates to try to break the David siege. It was a last-ditch effort by warriors who understood they had nothing to lose. They smashed into the David lines with fury and desperation, and for a few moments, a few precious seconds, they managed to kill hundreds of enemy soldiers. But the overwhelming numbers crushed the counterattack. Cavalry units were surrounded. Soldiers were hacked apart by enemy formations. The breakout failed completely. The few survivors limped back into the city. Their numbers diminished further. Their hopes crushed even more than before. The psychological pressure was designed to break men. The David army controlled every supply route. No reinforcements could arrive. No food could be brought in. The city was sealed off completely from the outside world. It was a tomb, and everyone inside knew it. As the siege intensified, the desperation inside Châu Thịnh transformed into something darker. Starvation became the reality. Soldiers were rationing food in handfuls. Horses were being eaten, then pets, then anything that could theoretically provide nutrition. The smell inside the city became horrific, a mixture of decay, human waste, rotting flesh, and desperation so thick it seemed to coat the throat. Discipline began to crack. Soldiers became delirious from hunger and exhaustion. Some commanders executed their own men to prevent riots and chaos from breaking the military order. Officers beat soldiers to keep them at their posts. Families huddled and destroyed buildings, parents watching children slowly weaken as starvation consumed them. The entire population was becoming a mass of human suffering. The Daviate forces, meanwhile, maintained their siege with the efficiency of a machine. They did not starve. They did not despair. They did not break. They were fed by supply lines stretching back to the heartland of Daviate territory. They could continue this siege indefinitely. Days, months, years if necessary. They had been ordered to destroy Champa completely, and Emperor Lê Thánh Tôn was a patient man. He would wait as long as it took. King Cham then watched his kingdom dying around him. He watched his people starving. He watched his soldiers growing weaker. He watched buildings crumble under siege bombardment. He watched everything his ancestors had built for over 1,000 years being systematically destroyed in front of his eyes. And he understood that the end was coming. The only question was how. After months of relentless siege, the Champa defenses finally began to collapse. The walls, pulverized by constant bombardment, had huge breaches. Soldiers were too weak from starvation to mount effective defensive positions. The city, its supplies were gone. The reserves were exhausted. There was nothing left to eat. There was nothing left to burn for fuel. There was nothing left except desperation and the certain knowledge that death was approaching. King Cham then made his final decision. Rather than surrender, which would certainly mean torture, execution, and the humiliation of his people being paraded as slaves through Daviate territory, he gathered the last remnants of his court, his family, and his closest advisors. He ordered his remaining soldiers to continue fighting to buy time, and then he climbed to the tallest tower in the city, looked out over the ruins of his kingdom, and made the choice that countless other leaders have made throughout history when faced with total annihilation. He refused to be captured alive. King Cham then, the last king of Champa, fell from that tower and died in the same city where his dynasty would finally be extinguished. When the gates of Châu Thịnh finally fell in the 10th month of 1471, the city overwhelmed by sheer numbers and starvation. What the Daviate soldiers found inside was not triumph but devastation. The entire city was a graveyard. Bodies lay in the streets. Thousands of civilians had died from starvation, disease, and siege bombardment. The population had been destroyed not just militarily but physically, psychologically, culturally, and completely. The Champa Kingdom was erased, not just defeated, not just conquered, but erased from existence as an independent political entity. The territory was absorbed into Daviate. The surviving Champa people were scattered, enslaved, or forced to assimilate into the dominant culture. The ancient kingdoms that had ruled these lands for over 1,000 years, since before the medieval world even existed, were gone forever. Their cities were destroyed, their temples were demolished or converted, their culture was systematically suppressed, their language was marginalized. Within a few generations, the very memory of independent Champa began to fade from the historical record. The Battle of Châu Thịnh was not just a military victory. It was the complete and total destruction of an entire civilization. And it fundamentally redrew the map of Southeast Asia in ways that echoed across centuries. The Daviate Kingdom, victorious and expanded, became the dominant power in the region. The territories it conquered, the fertile river valleys, the coastlines, the agricultural heartland of what we now call southern Vietnam, became the foundation of what would eventually transform into the modern nation of Vietnam itself. The entire geopolitical structure of Southeast Asia shifted in that moment. The lesson of Châu Thịnh resonates across time. Sometimes in history, there is no negotiation, no compromise, and no escape. There is only total victory or total annihilation. Emperor Lê Thánh Tôn understood this completely. He did not want to merely defeat Champa. He wanted to erase it so thoroughly that it could never threaten Daviate power again. And he succeeded. The kingdom that had existed for 1,000 years was destroyed in the span of a single siege. The Champa people who survived were scattered across what we now call Southeast Asia, to Cambodia, to Thailand, and eventually across the world. A few ethnic Cham people still exist today, a diaspora spread across multiple countries, keeping alive fragments of a culture that was nearly obliterated. But the kingdom itself, the political entity that once ruled these lands as an independent power, ceased to exist forever on the day Châu Thịnh fell. This is what happens when an unstoppable military force meets an immovable object. The collision destroys both. The Champa Kingdom could not resist. The Daviate army could not be stopped. The result was not merely a battle but a civilizational cataclysm that reshaped Southeast Asia forever. The Battle of Châu Thịnh in 1471 stands as one of the most brutal ancient battles in all of human history. A decisive turning point that erased an entire kingdom and rewrote the map of Southeast Asia for centuries to come. It is a reminder that in the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed, and empires that had stood for 1,000 years could disappear into dust in a single, terrible moment. If the relentless destruction of an entire kingdom and the reshaping of an entire continent sent chills down your spine, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel for more epic battles, legendary military strategies, and the most pivotal moments in military history that changed the world forever. And leave a comment below telling me, what was the most shocking moment for you in this incredible and terrible story? Could King Cham then have made a different choice that might have saved his kingdom? Or was the fall of Champa simply inevitable once the Đại Việt Empire decided its destruction? Tell me in the comments below, and I will see you in the next episode of the greatest battles in human history.